nice to see some familiar faces have filtered into the auditorium. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce Annual General Meeting. My name is Adam Smith, CEO of My IT Guy and Chair of the Board of Directors for the Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, as we seek a renewed relationship based on the foundation of mutual understanding and respect. As participants in today's event, we are coming together as one. We believe everyone is free to be their true self and receive the same respect and opportunity, regardless of age, ethnicity, gender, culture, identity, sexual orientation, beliefs, or language. Call to order. Notice to members having been properly given a declaration of a quorum. The meeting is properly constituted to conduct business. Call for a motion for approval of the 2021 Annual General Meeting minutes. We have discussion. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. I was asked to write some chair's remarks for the Advocate recently, and the thought that came to me was, to whom does our chamber belong? The Board of Directors are charged with directing the organization to promote and improve trade and commerce and the economic, civic, and social welfare of the region. But it doesn't belong to us. The President and CEO is responsible for the leadership and operations of the organization, as well as maintaining relationships with stakeholders in government, affiliated chambers of commerce, local businesses and community leaders, volunteers, and other key partners. But it doesn't belong to Ian. Sorry, Ian. The Chamber's staff work hard to execute on strategies and adapt quickly to emerging challenges, keeping all the pieces moving pieces of the organization flowing, but still doesn't belong to them. Our sponsors and member organizations are essential to the existence and purpose of our chamber, but still, it does not belong to them. The Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce belongs to all of you, if you want it to, because in fact the Chamber of Commerce truly belongs to its volunteers. Our volunteers each demonstrate their ownership by signing up, showing up, and speaking up. We all have our own reasons for why we got involved, with motivations as varied and unique as we are as individuals. Chances are you already know some of the passionate people contributing to our volunteer committees, whether you know these people as friends, colleagues, partners, mentors, frenemies, or co-opetition. I would encourage you to reach out and ask them what it's like to be actively involved and why they continue to volunteer their time and energy. Then take action and get yourself or your teams involved. By doing so, I have no doubt that you'll be able to say with confidence, the Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce belongs to me. So I would like to thank, of course, all of our volunteers. That I call for a motion approving financial statements.
Thanks, Adam. So first I'll just give a high-level summary before we get to the motion for approval of statements. The audited financials were included in the package that was sent out to all members. A couple key highlights. Balance sheet's quite healthy with both our current assets and liabilities in good shape, and our net assets grew during the fiscal year from $410,000 to $422,000. On the income statement, revenues declined to 2.2 million, primarily due to the end of the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, which the Chamber was able to take advantage of in the previous fiscal years. So revenues are kind of back to normal pre-pandemic levels. Again, very healthy though, and the Chamber finished the year with a small surplus, which is really what we budget and plan to do each year as a not-for-profit. And the most important part, we do have a clean audit opinion from our auditors, RLB LLP. So happy to report no issues on the audited statements. With that, we need a motion to approve the statements. So I'll say, on the recommendation of the Board of Directors, I move that the financial statements for the year ended June 30th, 2022, as audited by the firm RLB LLP, be approved.
Do we have discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Call for a motion appointing auditors for the 2022-2023 fiscal year. Any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Call for a motion for ratification of Chamber business. Any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. I'd like to call for a report from the chair of the nominating committee. Gina Hudell, as the board secretary, can you confirm that in accordance with our bylaws, a slate of candidates was set by the nominating committee and notice sent to Chamber voting delegates representing our member firms in good standing that an election is not required? Call for a motion for appointment of Glenn Thorpe, Flight Path, Shelley Forwell, Walter Fady, Nick Hefner, Hefner Lexus and Hefner Toyota, Carlene Carroll, Wilfrid Laurier University, for an additional 2-year term. These individuals are currently at the end of their 2-year term and will be appointed for another 2-year term. Any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. As such, I am pleased to announce that the following individuals form the 2022-2023 Board of Directors for the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce. Adam Smith, my IT guy. Glenn Thorpe, Fly GTA Airlines. Brad Dunbar, Dunbar & Associates Professional Corporation. Chris Ronan, Ronan Consulting. Gina Hudell, Pride and Grooming. Scott Gilfillan, PwC. Sean Sullivan, Gowling WLG. Richard Jock, BMO Financial Group. Wendy Campbell, the Food Bank of Waterloo Region. Ajoa Minta, For All Ice Cream, Nick Hefner, Hefner Lexus and Hefner Toyota, Shelley Forwell, Walter Fady, Carlene Carroll, Wilfrid Laurier University, Ron Gagnon, Grand River Hospital, Jody Armit, H2R Business Solutions Inc., Mariam Rasool, Stelco, Roberto Villamar, Cogeco SA. This is your Board of Directors for 2022-2023. May I ask the members of the Board of Directors to please come forward and be recognized. Yeah, everyone to the stage, please. In case that was a little unclear. Wonderful. I'd like to introduce City of Kitchener Councillor Christine Michaud to perform the official induction of the board.
Good afternoon and congratulations to the new board members. I'm now going to say the oath, and when I'm completed, I'd like you just to respond with an I do. I swear that I will faithfully and truly perform my duty as a board member of the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce, that I will in all matters connected with the discharge of such duty do all things as I shall truly and conscientiously believe to be adapted to promote the objects for which the said chamber was constituted, according to the true intent and meaning of the same, so help me God.
I do. Thank you, Christine. And thank you to our board. You can have your seats again. I would now like to thank our corporate partners, which you can find in the Chamber's annual report, for their support over the past year. The Chamber Chairs Circle, BDO, BMO, Bank of Montreal, Cowan Insurance Group, Enbridge, Equitable Life of Canada, EY, GHD, Google, Gowling WLG Canada LLP, Hefner Lexus and Hefner Toyota, Home Hardware Stores Limited, Huawei, Immigration Partnership, Manulife, MCAP, McCarter Graspin Lawyers, Meridian, MNP LLP, Sun Life, University of Waterloo. Our chamber patron sponsors, BDC, BlackBerry, PwC, SG Cunningham, TD, and Wilfrid Laurier University. Our title sponsors, Libro Credit Union, Business Around 5, Manulife Business Success Series, YNCU Chamber Young Professionals, MNP LLP Speed Networking Series, Hefner Lexus and Hefner Toyota Women's Leadership Series. Trustee sponsors, Activa, Bell, Conestoga Meat Packers, KPMG, MTE, Walter Fady, Waterloo EDC. Our media partners, City News 570, 96.7 Chime FM, Country 106.7, CTV, Waterloo Region Rural Post. And our physician recruitment sponsors. Thank you to all of our physician recruitment sponsors for the continued support of the Chamber's healthcare initiatives. These sponsors are crucial to the success of the Chamber Healthcare Resource Council's annual Family Medicine Resident Weekend. Going into its 20th year, this event is instrumental in residents' decisions to establish their family practices in the region of Waterloo. Our volunteers, you know, there's a special place in my heart for our volunteers. So try not to kill this microphone here. Please do take a moment to read over the names here. These are the committed folk that you should really talk to, and I would encourage you to do so. I would like to thank especially our retiring committee chairs, Jordan Snyder from Business After 5 and Kim Wilhelm from the Women's Leadership. And of course, we have a retiring director. This year we say farewell to one retiring director who has fulfilled her maximum 6-year term. I first met Alison Burke through the Chamber Young Professionals several years before we both joined the board. I've known Alison to always serve our board with equal amounts of enthusiasm and professionalism, and she's always been a consistent advocate for small business supports. Thank you, Alison. Please come up to the stage. Elbow. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Retiring members are always welcome to volunteer again in the future. So even though we say goodbye to this phase of Alison's board membership, she's always welcome to come back and continue to support small business in her own way with the rest of the board. There we are. We will now hold a short meeting of the Board of Directors to appoint the Executive Committee for 2022-2023. I'd like to call the board meeting to order. In accordance with our bylaws, the Board of Directors recommends the appointment of the members of the Executive Committee for a 1-year term. Can I get a call for that motion? Any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. I have a call for a motion to adjourn the board meeting. Any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. I am pleased to announce that the following individuals form the 2022-2023 Executive Committee for the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce. Please stand to be recognized as I call your name. Scott Gilfillan, Chair. Myself, Past Chair. Brad Dunbar, Treasurer. Wendy Campbell, Vice Chair. Gina Hudell, Vice Chair. Sean Sullivan, Secretary. To inquire as to whether there is any further business, and then to call for motion. Sorry, that's written weirdly. I would like to call for a motion adjourning the annual general meeting. I would now like to introduce our new board chair, Scott Gilfillan.
Thanks, Adam. And I do want to take a couple seconds too, just to thank Adam's leadership over the last 2 years as chair. Obviously, through the pandemic, it's been a challenging time both for the chamber and its members, and Adam's been a steady hand during that period. So really want to thank his leadership and happy to have him as past chair for another year. I don't know what's in the box, but it is gigantic, so it's got to be good. So thank you, everybody, and happy to be coming on as board chair for the next 2 years. I have been involved in the chamber the past number of years, both as part of the Business Excellence Awards nomination committee for I think 6 or 7 years, as well as part of the broader board and also the finance committee and treasurer the last couple of years. So really looking forward to the chair role, and I know I got big shoes to fill with Adam coming off. But yeah, looking forward to it. I do want to thank the rest of the board for their support, and also thank Ian and the staff and team at the Chamber, which are so valuable to us, for their support as well. We are also excited to announce, kind of changing gears here, that we are accepting nominations for the 2023 Business Excellence Awards Gala. That's going to be held Thursday, March 23rd, 2023. So if you want to nominate a local business, you can visit beagala.ca, and nominations are open from now until November 18th. Also really excited to have a guest speaker from Scotiabank, and Scotiabank is our speaker sponsor today, and appreciate their ongoing support. So excited to have the opportunity to introduce James Daneman, District VP, Waterloo Region District with Scotia, to introduce today's speaker. James.
Thank you, Scott, and good afternoon, everyone. Scotiabank is excited to be back once again as the speaker sponsor for this year's AGM. On behalf of our over 250 Scotiabankers locally, I want to let you know that we're committed to giving back to this great community of ours. From our Scotia Rise and our Scotiabank Women in Leadership Initiative to supporting you in your rapid business growth, we are breaking down barriers and helping customers and communities be better off today and tomorrow. I now have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker. Rebekah Young is Vice President, Head of Inclusion and Resilience Economics at Scotiabank. Rebekah provides thought leadership on inclusive economic growth that is resilient in an evolving and ever-changing world. Rebekah joined Scotiabank in 2019 as Director, Fiscal and Provincial Economics, while also covering the global auto sector. Previously, she held roles at the IMF, the Department of Finance, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She holds a BA in Chemical Engineering from McGill University, a Master's of Sciences in Environmental Policy from London School of Economics in London, England, and an MBA from INSEAD in Fontainebleau, France and Singapore. Rebekah is joining us virtually from Halifax today, and moderating the Fireside Chat is Ian McLean, President and CEO of Greater KW Chamber. So please join me in welcoming Rebekah and Ian.
Afternoon, and welcome to Rebekah. My spies, I have a daughter that's at Dalhousie University, told me it was very foggy today. I'm going to try that again. My spies tell me it was foggy in Halifax today. So we're going to get, there's Rebekah. I think we see you over there. Good. Was that true? Foggy in Halifax today?
Well, that was true, but I don't think anyone in my house left the house because power was finally on, and they made up for all the lack of internet for the last 4 days.
Just gonna get, we're just gonna get your volume up a bit, Rebekah, so everyone can hear you.
Okay, I'll try to speak louder as well. I was just saying we've spent the whole day inside using the internet after 4 days without power, so we don't know what the weather is outside right now.
Okay, probably need a bit more volume. We need more volume, folks? Yeah, more volume. Gwen or whoever's down there. So we're gonna get started. I'll start by while they're just tweaking your mic, Rebekah. And thank you so much for making. It's not on your end. You're good. It's we just need to do something here. Wanted to thank James. He's been a great partner. He's just arrived about a year ago into this marketplace, and has been actively engaging with the Chamber and taking Scotiabank's involvement with not only us here at the Chamber, but in other with other community partners to a new level. And we very much appreciate that. Last year, just as we set the stage, Rebekah, we had JP, the Chief Economist for Scotia, at our annual meeting. It was a great opportunity to kind of set the stage of what was happening as we got to the end of COVID, and or we were thinking we were getting to the end of COVID, and sort of made our way through. So it was a fascinating conversation we had with JP last year. It is great having Scotia and as one of our partners, and certainly sponsoring this event, to help us get the year off to a good start, and to help, and with Rebekah's help today, to give us a sense of where we are and where we're headed. we are lucky to have partners like Scotia. Our work for members and for the community would not happen if it was not for the support of sponsors like Scotia and many others that you saw earlier in the presentation. But let's get started. Rebekah, you were recently appointed, and your background is impressive to say the least. You were recently appointed as Scotiabank's first head of inclusion and resilience economics. Can you give us a bit of a context of the importance of this role and how it changes your approach to economics?
Yes, very briefly, what we're trying to do with this new role is look at economic issues through a slightly different lens. And what we've realized, particularly during the pandemic, is that headline numbers can mask a lot. And so it really can mask people, parts of the population that are left behind, or sectors or regions. And importantly, we can also miss the slower moving trends because we're so focused on kind of the daily movement of markets and interest rates that we miss that bigger picture. So in my role, I'm really going to continue watching those daily movements, but also take the time to step back and think, what are we missing in our kind of hyper focus on the near term?
So I think I think inclusion is one of those terms now that I think everyone has got more of a handle on. That inclusion, diversity, equity are things that are they're not off on the side. They're table stakes. Every organization needs to be doing it for any number of different reasons. But I want to drill a little bit down on the resilience part, because I want to know what that includes. Is that really the environmental impact? I mean, talk about the resilience part, because I think that we've seen over the last 2 years, 3 years actually, with COVID, resilience is a undervalued commodity or skill for business and individuals.
Absolutely. And so resilience is a very big word, and quite frankly, a catch-all for many different trends that are coming our way. So for a business, it might be resilience to, slow-moving demographic changes that we'll talk about likely today. It can also mean, resilience to climate change and adaptation and transition and what's going on. It can also be financial resilience, and that's, much, in our face right now as we see interest rates going up. So it really is this idea of, as change and, as economies evolve, inevitably we do have to adapt and be resilient, both to near-term shocks, but also to these longer-term changes.
And just one last follow-up to that. I think when we talk about, there was a time when we talked about resilience as it related to the environment. It was almost as a separate piece. Those things are resilience and the impact of environment, I think, are pretty closely linked now. Whether you're an insurer with increasing weather events, those sorts of things, rising tides, the whole thing, that resilience is impacted. The environmental part of that impacts your finances, supply chains, and that's the connector that you're trying to pull all those pieces in resilience together.
Yes, absolutely. And I would add, what we've learned in the last couple of months even is that resilience on that climate front is also, quite frankly, resilience to the potential that we might have a disorderly transition. So we're seeing, Europe heading into a recession and, setting up as businesses aren't able to even operate at full capacity without enough energy. So, that isn't the path we want to be on, but we do need to be prepared for developments like that. And I would just point out another part of the role and why it's really important, we think, at Scotiabank Economics to have this role is not just to point out or flag some of these trends and some of, inclusion and resilience trends, but also to push the policy front to make sure we can, try to improve the outcomes where we do see gaps, whether it's in public policy or private sector roles. And so that's really important that we recognize private sector, but banks in particular in Canada have a very privileged role that policymakers do come to us and ask for input, for example, in budget making processes. So really, we want to capitalize on that opportunity to provide very thoughtful policy areas where we can look at better outcomes, both for private sector as well as for Canadian societies.
So there's a lot of big changes taking place in the global economy, and want to talk about those. And one of the reasons that we wanted to have you here today is to bring those global and national trends, but what it means to in the local marketplace. What does it mean here in Waterloo region? So I appreciate your insights. And of course, let's start with the big one. We all know it's the global economy, the Canadian economy, the North America, every part of the economy is facing sky-high inflation. Interest rates are skyrocketing as the antidote to combat inflation. And in the midst of all that, which counterintuitive when employment is high, meaning if employment numbers are high, we're still talking, and in many views, there's talk of a recession. So how do you put all of those pieces together? Where are we today?
Well, very complex and a lot of uncertainty right now. I'm sure last year you got the same message from us, huge amounts of uncertainty, but it was really a different type of uncertainty, a lot of pandemic uncertainty. And so, 30 seconds of, what happened during the first 2 years of the pandemic, Canada really led the world in terms of its stringency of lockdowns. It led the world in terms of the size of its stimulus and fiscal and monetary. So we had lots of pent up demand, and then you layer onto that supply chains globally collapsing, and you get to where we were at the end of 2021, which is, inflation was just heading up, up, up. And recall, even at the end of 2021, central bankers were still kind of head in the sand, we're going to keep it low for long. It was really a wake-up call when the tragic invasion of Ukraine happened and energy prices, went through the roof, food prices went through the roof. Central bankers woke up and realized, gee, inflation is becoming unmoored. And that's when we saw from February onward around the world, interest rates really starting to ratchet up. And so the biggest kind of concern right now globally and in the US and Canada is, are policymakers going to drive us into a recession, either intentionally or accidentally? So you have a lot of these analogies of the pilot, can they land the plane, and is it going to be a soft or hard landing? So, that's really where we are right now, is this uncertainty as to just how hard that landing will be. And we're already almost, well, we hope we're almost approaching the ground, because here in Canada, as we've seen, 300 basis point lift off just in, a short 6 months. So I would say when we look around, China's likely already in a recession. Europe is, most likely heading into a recession into next year as they face this energy crisis. And the US has had a bit of a technical recession, so a softening, but I wouldn't say alarmingly so. Canada, we actually think is going to lead the pack in terms of advanced economies. So we really, the commodity prices really lifted the outlook through a positive terms of trade for Canada. But there's no doubt about it, we are looking to a slowdown here in Canada. And the real question is it going to be a smaller recession or a bigger recession? And we think that, we need to be nuanced here, is that we're looking at more likely a pause. So a couple of quarters of flat, maybe negative growth. Lots of media headlines are going to talk about kind of recession and fear mongering, but we don't think we're going to see the tanking of those strong employment numbers. It's going to deteriorate a little bit, but not really kind of tank. And then Canadians are going to have a bit of a rebound when policymakers finally finish landing that plane, and we kind of figure out what the damage is.
From your many vantages from being the IMF and the World Bank and those types of organizations, that I kind of was thinking about this session and saying, not only do we have a global pandemic, then we have effectively a war in the Ukraine. Supply chains are broken. I mean, this is I was going to call it the perfect storm, but it's anything but perfect. It's all of the worst things that could possibly happen. Is that the sense that not only that we had all of these things stacking up? Is there really a playbook that governments and bankers and monetary folks are able to look at in terms of getting us through this?
No, I think a frank answer is no. And that's where I do think that as economists, we need a little bit of humility. And first of all, huge amounts of uncertainty around geopolitical risk. And that's what we've learned is, lots of, policy makers' decisions that are hard to model, hard to predict. And we're also looking still at huge distortions in economies. And so, rebound year over year numbers really don't tell us a whole lot, not terribly informative. And so if we try to, use our models to look at, well, what happened, 30 years ago or 20 years ago, or even during the global financial crises, it's not terribly informative. So we are having to use a lot of judgment and, quite frankly, a lot of humility of where might we be wrong and what alternative, information or data points can we look at to, to question our assumptions. And that's where, right now, I think we're really looking carefully at inflation and our assumptions. Have we really peaked in Canada? And importantly, the US hasn't peaked. So what does that mean for interest rates? And wages, we've shifted from supply chains are improving, but wages may be the next shoe to drop. They're starting to pick up. And so that could drive a second round inflation and even higher interest rates than we have in our current outlook, which are already pretty high. So we do have a lot of assumptions there, but I don't think we're hearing enough in media, for example, that's fear mongering on recession, about the resilience and the distortions in the system that the pandemic created. So Canadians, for example, are sitting on higher cash balances than they were pre-pandemic. For a period of time they couldn't spend, and then government transfers really lined their pockets, and they've been slowly unwinding that. They've got more equity, they piled into mortgages, and so they have more equity behind that while they paid down credit card debts. And yes, they have seen, house price corrections, and they have seen equity market corrections, but what's your base? If you're looking at house prices, for example, you're still, likely up, somewhere in the order of 30, 40, even 50%, depending on what your city is and when you bought. So, the net wealth has corrected in the near term, but certainly equity, is way better than it was pre-pandemic. So, lots of resilience in the system. As I say, we are looking at what, could be defined as a pause. So a couple quarters where Canadian households and businesses are worried about that kind of hard landing as the plane comes down. And so they stop spending for a bit. And then when we get through there, they start unleashing some of these savings and, really, lean on their balance sheets that, that they had built up over the course of the pandemic.
So I wanted to go to technology and the tech ecosystem here. We'll come back to that in just a minute, but you touched on housing, and housing is so incredibly important as a driver of the economy right across the country, but certainly here in Waterloo region. We've seen housing developments are making headlines because as quickly as they rose in a year or so ago, they're cooling just as quickly. Maybe put that in context of rising interest rates, the cooling of housing prices, and what that means, and how concerning it should be for communities like ours.
So it's a really good question, and obviously, Canadians are big homeowners, and it's a big purchase, and it's a big part of our consumption, and then consequently, it's a big part of our growth outlook. So clearly, the slowing residential investment is part of why we see this waning economic outlook for Canada. And I would say it's also very interest rate sensitive. And so you have to remember that rising interest rates by the Bank of Canada are intended to slow demand, including home purchases. And quite frankly, even a quarter ago, as the Bank of Canada was starting to lift its rates, it had a deputy governor saying, quite frankly, we don't quite know if Canadians have so much pent-up demand and resilience that they're just going to keep on buying, or is it going to turn sharply? And so they, quite frankly, didn't know if their rate rising would work. So what we are seeing is, yes, the rate rising is working. It's having the intended impact of slowing sales. But this is where you have to read the numbers carefully and, look beyond the headlines because, for example, what we see is that sales numbers nationwide are down 30%, but they were up at, kind of super unsustainable levels during the course of the pandemic. The sales activity or level is actually back down to pre-pandemic sales numbers. So, you have to keep that into perspective. Likewise with home prices, if you adjust for, the average home sales pricing is down somewhere around 15%, but still up about 15%. But once you adjust for people buying smaller, more affordable houses these days, the price correction is much smaller. So I just say again, we've got more to go in housing. And if you look at Kitchener-Waterloo, they really benefited from the work remotely and more affordable prices. And so the numbers are even sharper there in terms of how much I think I looked at the number that the average sales price was up somewhere around 70% from pre-pandemic up to the February peak. So it's come off about, I think, about 20% or so. So it's still, again, that equity that the average home buyer would have is pretty big. And the second point I would mention that is a bit overblown, I think, also is from a financial stability perspective. So, keep in mind 2/3 of Canadians are homeowners, about half of them are mortgaged, and of that, the majority are fixed term, 5 years. So they're not going to have a sudden, interest rate shock. It is going to be slower moving. And those with variable, many of them have fixed payments. So, so it is, I would say, something that's definitely causing a slowdown. Is definitely causing what we call a wealth effect, that households are, looking at what they thought their net worth was in February and, kind of upset that it looks a lot less than it did before. And if they're renewing or buying first time, they're paying more for their mortgage. So it is definitely having economic implications for the National and the Ontario, Kitchener-Waterloo regions and households. But it's really, it is coming from a cooling from unsustainable activities that we saw during the pandemic.
Now, one of the things that is increasingly becoming a challenge right across the country is affordability of housing. So, and that brings in accessibility for low income or those that don't have the resources to buy. So the rental market is very stretched. One of the things that we see, and it affects all kinds of groups, from Indigenous to young people being able to get into the housing market. There are a whole range of those issues that all come together because it's obviously a supply problem because the demand is certainly there. There's a supply aspect to this. What's your recipe, or what are the two or three things you're recommending to decision makers and policymakers about addressing the increasing affordability of housing that's across the country?
That's definitely, you touched on the supply challenge that we have in Canada, and that it's particularly exacerbated in Ontario, that, even with the softening that we're seeing in housing markets and that we expect in the pipeline, housing is still expensive. So that price, and particularly the price to income in most parts of the country, are still unaffordable for many. So and then that's even more pronounced for vulnerable or marginalized populations who already have, working against them, lower income or even fixed income, where right now inflation is really eating into that income as they spend more on energy and food, and they have less job security as well. And so, that, has pretty much priced them out of housing markets. And so we think, first and foremost is that we've got to address overall this housing supply issue in Canada, which, seriously lags its peers in advanced economies. And again, it's very exacerbated in Ontario. And keep in mind also what's different for Canada and particularly for Ontario is that we're one of the few advanced countries where the population is actually growing and growing quite substantially. And so, just to put numbers to it, with our population, we're essentially adding a Kitchener-Waterloo every year and a half to the country. So no panacea to supply. We did, chair a group for the Ontario government last year, talking about the need for aggressive targets with credible plans. And part of our recommendations were around densification. So need for higher densification, particularly around kind of transit lines, access to workplaces, zoning reforms as well, and funding or incentives for municipalities that are able to unlock some of these regulatory or planning hurdles to unlocking more supply. And I guess the final point too is not to forget the renters in that whole equation. And you talk about rent prices going up and actually outpacing home prices in appreciation in some regions. So we really have to figure out how do we destigmatize that the renting versus home owning, and how do we also level the playing field for renters versus homeowners.
With every challenge, there are opportunities. We're very blessed to be in this region. Waterloo region is obviously home to one of the countries, in fact, North America's growing tech ecosystems, a leader in that space. And that's right across verticals within the technology space, everything from construction, innovation to software, but also in the manufacturing space as well. So, in terms of technology being a driver of economic growth, and in your title of resilience and inclusion, technology is one of those great equalizers. What do those developments mean in terms of technology for the economy here, and this sector? How can it impact softening the headwinds that we're facing right now?
Well, definitely. So, in economic terms, the tech sector is exposed to, cyclical trends. So a slowing economy, usually the tech sectors would suffer more than other sectors that, things like energy, stuff that we, food, stuff that we need, non-discretionary. So, I would say first and foremost, Ontario and Kitchener-Waterloo, regional differences are smaller right now in the sense that it's the national and global drivers that are really weighing on the outlook for, most areas. And then differences are more modest. So, to put that in context, it is going to be global developments and to some extent national developments that affect where inflation and interest rates go. And that in turn will determine whether we're in a recession and whether we see even further sharp corrections for the tech sector or not. So it is, there are these exogenous trends that, that the sector is going to have to weather. But I would say that, the downturn that we're looking at for the tech sector right now is amplified in this round. And so, in the early phases of the pandemic, we just had so much capital flowing with all, monetary easing and low interest rates that we had this search for yield. So just, an exuberance that, both had, excess capital and, taking on more risk. And not to mention the work from home specific drivers that really fueled a whole new renewed interest in different, technologies that would promote that. So we've seen some of that starting to deflate those exceptional factors from the pandemic. So, certainly credit tightening is having an impact, and also then on the earnings side for the sector as they're exposed to this fear of recession and what it'll mean for demand, and then of course credit spreads as seen as riskier investment. So I think it is, it's facing a slowdown. But I think longer term, the drivers are still there, and we are seeing an uptake more generally in capital investments by business sectors across Canada, and so hopefully there is an ability to weather through this downturn and see things like persistent labor shortages that are going to require quite frankly more productivity, more capital, and technological investment.
As we want to touch on talent now, because I think this is the part where we say we got to walk and chew gum at the same time. We've got inflation, we've got interest rates, we got financial issues, housing, affordability. But if I really had to boil it down, and this is right across sectors and right across size of business, from the first, second, and third thing that most businesses talk to me about is talent. They can't get it, they can't keep it. And that really is one of the things restricting even more growth when there is business to be done, is they just don't have the people. So as we looked you do work obviously in your role, and we understand the changes, or do we need to understand the changes in the labor demographics, and what recommendations is Scotia making to say, how do we advance this growing issue of talent? Because it's right across from trades to engineers to skilled workers in advanced manufacturing. Take your pick, there's a shortage of it. How do we kind of address that labor demographic, which is it's not ephemeral, and it's not because of COVID. It was happening before COVID. It's now it's at a different level.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head that we first of all have to recognize that especially we've had a couple months of weak labor data. Like, we shouldn't say we're back to having plenty of workers because people, we've had a few weak months. That this is a structural issue, and really what we've seen in the last census data is that 1 in 5 Canadian workers is approaching retirement age. And, actually when you dig through some of the weak months of job data, it was, 55 plus leaving the workforce. And so we do have, demographic shifts that, are leading to what is going to likely be an ongoing labor challenge that already existed prior to the pandemic. And another indicator that, quite frankly, we've never seen as economists as high before are the number of jobs that are sitting empty right now, and that has topped 1 million. And so it's a doubling relative to pre-pandemic, and really is coming down, a little bit on things like Indeed postings, but it's not turning sharply. It can be older Canadians, so incentives to work longer, Canadians with disabilities or women, youth, other marginalized populations. So, finding ways, what do we need to do to bring them into the labor force? And I think also, what we're seeing right now, we're seeing this term that's trending in the US right now called employee hoarding. And one thing during the global financial crisis is as soon as the economy started tanking, businesses let go of their people. And that's, part of the reason why we saw, a really sharp and, long entrenched downturn in US, Canadian, global economies. But what we're seeing now, because this, recognition of labor shortages, is that businesses are saying, well, hey, there's such a big, labor shortage and transaction cost to losing people and rehiring that I'm going to keep them and see how it goes. So I think we need to think a little bit about that, also about job reskilling, job retraining as demands change. But finally, just back to that capital investment, is that we have to learn to do more with less people, and productivity in Canada is really abysmal. So, I think we need to make those investments in recognition that we won't be able to rely on what we might call human stimulus, so more laborers, without actually investing in that on the capital side.
Well, I just wanted to reassure Scott and the board that there's no danger of me retiring. I still have 2 kids to put through Dalhousie, so that puts things on for at least 4 more years. But seriously, we have one of the things that we've worked on very closely here in the region of Waterloo, and have for years actually, and the chamber started working in the skilled immigrant space probably 17 or 18 years ago, if not longer. Maybe speak to the needs, or the need for immigrants, particularly those that can fill some of the skilled gaps. But what do we need to do as a country to make sure that immigrants coming here can reach their full potential and help in the tremendous gap that is in our labor market?
That's a very big source of where we are filling some of the labor gaps right now. When you think of the numbers that are coming in, the barriers, I would say, first of all, participation does tend to be lower for newcomers, particularly recent newcomers. And so we need to start figuring out, what is it that we need to do to enable them to participate more fully. And they can be quite complex for, an individual, depending on household, from language to skills, cultural barriers to Canadian work experience. So, Scotiabank does a lot through its Scotia Rise program on figuring out how can we address some of those barriers. But I think another point that, we've been looking at lately is that newcomers are coming, they're coming young. So they're, not completely offsetting aging Canadians, but they're certainly, coming younger, and they're coming better educated. So 60% of newcomers have a university degree, but only about half of them actually work in a job that use it. Those numbers are flipped for Canadians. So Canadians with an education degree are, fewer and more likely to use that degree. So we need to think about how, that's basically, capital, human capital that we're not leveraging. And there may be legitimate reasons, and they may be opting to take, jobs initially that aren't using that. But we've got to figure out, both for our own economic benefits in Canada, but also for the households that are impacted and, also face lower wages. And, so I think we need more ambition, both, from policymakers as well as private sector that, that is hiring these newcomers.
I want to take advantage of having you here today, and maybe bring the practical to the theory of inclusion in economic principles, because I think sometimes when we're thinking about new approaches to things, we get lost in the theory of it. But bring us down to the practical of why inclusion in economic principles is going to be so important, starting now, but with each passing day.
Yeah, so, we talked a bit about labor shortage and, in very simple terms, if you take apart, if you, set aside the ethical or moral obligations that we have to really, make sure we're not leaving parts of society behind, in simple economic terms, GDP is simply the hours worked of all Canadians times their productivity. If you very simply rudimentary want to calculate it. So the more bodies we get in the workforce, the more national wealth we're creating. And so, that really means we should be, from economic terms alone, looking at all these pockets of, people in society that aren't working and figuring out how can we get them into the labor force. And you touched on, very real conversations that you have with businesses that can't meet demand out there because of labor shortages. And then you have indirect, they go out, they have jobs, they have income, and they go on and spend. And so you have these multiplier effects in the economy. And importantly, they're paying taxes. So you're able to, pay for higher services, and you're consequently lowering government expenditures on some of the, social programs that we do have. So in simple terms, lots of economic kind of win-wins for all if we can get more parts of society working. Into the workforce. There are some areas that are harder to capture that, I think we need to really be cognizant of, and that's the kind of the different ideas in the innovation and creativity. And newcomers are a good example of that. Newcomers are far more likely to set up new businesses than Canadian-born peers, and more likely in kind of that innovation or tech space. So that is, harder to model, but something that we really need to capitalize on as a country. And then the final point that also, again, I think sometimes as economists we miss are these nonlinear disruptions that if you leave the geopolitical unrest that we're seeing in parts of the world and quite frankly in parts of this country, that when you leave parts of society behind or sectors behind, you can create this friction and this unrest or this lack of cohesion that could lead to change in governance and that could actually ultimately leave us all worse off as a result. So I think we need to be cognizant of those geopolitical risks as well.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, and you and I are between this group here and cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. So we got to stay to 5 minutes, but maybe 2 or 3 questions, like your a short kind of top 3 on a couple of things. One is we obviously have had this huge disruption over the last couple of years. What are the 2, 3, 4 things that you think will really be necessary to drive a sustainable economic recovery, not just in the short term, but in the medium term as well?
So, number 1, number 2, number 3 is get inflation under control. Get us out of this uncertainty, this policy uncertainty that, inflation is here to stay and, policymakers getting it wrong, because there's just this elevated uncertainty that's weighing on sentiment everywhere. Sentiment's really lousy, even if fundamentals are relatively resilient here in Canada. That can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think that's really, we've got to be kind of laser focused in the near term on, making sure that our policymakers are working together in doing that. I guess a second point looking beyond that would really be investing in people and capital. I think that we've forgotten about that capital side in Canada for some time. We're really overly focused from a policy perspective on transfers. It's more politically palatable to, send money directly to households or, provinces. It's more arm's length to see how can we support businesses to enhance their capacity, their productive capacity. So we really need to shift our models from a kind of a tax and spend approach to an invest and spend approach in the Canadian economy.
So in the longer term, what are some of the broader trends that you think business should be aware of, whether it's this group here, which spans everything from small business to manufacturing, investment, services, you name it, it's in the room and it's in our membership. Is it advancements in productivity? Is it technology adoption? Is it the human capital or the human part of it, of having workers? What are some of those broader trends that we should be looking for and starting to plan for?
Well, we talked about demographics, so I won't go into that again, but I do think that's a longer term trend that's, here tomorrow that we need to think about is how do we achieve more with less people? How do we, again, invest in people and the capital and tools we're giving them? So I think that's here to stay and we need to, think about that. Another one, again, right on our front door now is the future of our supply chains and what is that new normal? So we've seen decades of globalization, a lot of uncertainty during the Trump years and, but nobody really foresaw a complete reversal. We thought we'd get through, that government regime and that we go back to normal. And that clearly was upended by the pandemic. Now I would say we're not likely looking at a complete reversal of globalization or deglobalization, but we are likely looking at a new normal for how, we manage supply chains, how much inventory, do we keep on side. So I think we need to be braced for what does that look like. And, relatedly, as, I mentioned the transition, this net zero, the path to net zero is it's going to have some fundamental changes for Canadian and global economies and sectors. And, plenty of opportunities, I think, in the tech space and in the EV auto space and supply chains there, particularly locally. Those are really bright spots where lots of investment is going to be going in and providing a real opportunity. But there's also that disorderly path that we seem to be on because we have an underinvestment, quite frankly, on the clean energy side. And so we may very well have a bit of turbulence and, disorderly policy paths and, elevated energy prices for some time. So we need to be braced for all the, uncertainty that will come with that. And just finally, if I can say something we need, but we're unlikely to see is a rethink again on government. Expenses have been under tremendous pressure, including education, healthcare, and declining tax revenues as we have shrinking labor forces. So we really need to figure out how do we grow that pie and then redistribute because, we are setting up for some challenging trade-offs for governments across the country.
Okay, last question. I always have to ask this when we're doing radio interviews because we always forget to let you ask the questions that you really want to answer. So anything we've missed out or what would be what are the 2 or 3 things you want to leave the audience with today that coming out of this conversation that we've had today?
I think I would reiterate how we started the conversation, just the enormous amount of uncertainty right now. But don't throw in, the towel just yet. That a recession is not a certainty. It's definitely a risk, but likely more of this pause or a small R recession. And so for practical business planning purposes, I think that means, you're not completely battening down the hatches and assuming that the hurricane is heading your way. You are, kind of building that resilience that, things may slow down for a couple of quarters, but we may have rebounds. So how are you positioned to really capitalize on those rebounds and legitimately so in a world where, inventories may still be depleted for durables, for example. So, we're really more in a world of scenarios than a baseline where we say this is the path. You really have to be prepared for a multiple range of outcomes. And at the same time, just positioning for some of these longer term trends that we touched on.
Listen, I want to thank you so much to Scotiabank and to James Danneman for making this connection with you, Rebekah. You're always welcome in Waterloo region. There's more to touch on. If the fog lifts and you ever get out of Halifax, you're welcome here in Waterloo region. But thanks so much for joining us today. We very much appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting me and have a good evening.
I think we're back to Scott.
Thanks, Ian. Just want to again thank Rebekah and the team at Scotiabank. Certainly valuable insights for all of us here. And thanks to Scotiabank for their continued support. We did also want to take a quick moment as well to thank the sponsors of today's event. So our event sponsors, Cowan Insurance Group, EY, Home Hardware Stores Limited, MCAP, and the University of Waterloo. Our volunteer appreciation sponsor, Cowan Insurance Group, and our speaker sponsor, Scotiabank. So thanks everybody for attending today's event. The event's not over yet. Hope that everybody can join us for drinks and appetizers in the hall. Thank you.